Okay, gang, let's get started. We're interrelating in the course, as you know, the issue of global climate change that we spent the first part of the course on from the beginning of April to the end of April. We've now spent most of this period between April 29th and last week doing the issue of the impeachment, the various issues related to it. And today we're going to be transitioning into part 3, which is the relationship of the uprisings in North Dakota against the Dakota Access Pipeline and the upcoming uprising against the Keystone XL pipeline that's going to be coming down through South Dakota next to the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation. And we're going to be talking about this issue of the role of the indigenous people, not only here in North America, but also in Central America and in the Middle East, against the rise of the increase in the output of petroleum in the world, directly in the face of the demand on the part of 193 different countries joining together in the Paris Accords in December of 2017, demanding a reduction in the burning of fossil fuels. This extraordinary upsurge in the development and burning of fossil fuels on the part of the Trump administration is one of the issues that we will be coordinating with the issue of his potential impeachment. All of this issue of the indigenous people and their role in opposing this massive increase in fossil fuel production in the face of the global climate change comes in the context of the decision on the part of Donald Trump immediately after his inauguration to issue an executive order. It was the second thing he did in office, in fact. We know that the first thing that he did in office and coming into office on the 21st of January of 2019 was to issue this prohibition against all Islamic people coming into the United States. And the second thing he did on January 24th was issue this unilateral executive order ordering the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to reverse their previous administrative decision requiring that the Energy Transfer Partners Corporation had to stop the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline because they were failing to comply with the requirements of the Environmental Protection Act. Trump issued this executive order on the 24th of January. And I wanted to point out that between his coming to office on January 21st, all the way up until April 5th, that first January, February, March, into the beginning of April, Stephen Bannon sat on the National Security Council. And Steve Bannon was considered to be Donald Trump's primary political strategist. And it was quite unique to have that type of a person put on the National Security Council, which is usually confined to personnel directly involved in the national security of the United States, ranging from the Attorney General to the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the head of the CIA and others. But Bannon, we got a report. It's a single source at this time, but that Bannon in the National Security Council meeting specifically stated that we, talking about the Trump administration, must treat the North Dakota Lakota who are rising up against the Dakota Access Pipeline and the potential Keystone Pipeline. We must treat them as anti-capitalist, anti-Christian, religiously driven, indigenous jihadist terrorists, and that they ought to be dealt with accordingly. And as it turns out, that is exactly how they were being treated. The oil corporations that were partners in the Energy Transfer Partners Corporation that was building the pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline. They called in, as we've mentioned earlier in passing, they called in the Tiger Swan Private Military Corporation to actually deploy against the Lakota people and their allies who had set up camp adjacent to the pipeline route and were publicly protesting the building of this pipeline directly under their sole source of fresh drinking water. And the Tiger Swan Private Military Corporation, as you may recall us mentioning, again, just in passing, but now it's going to be getting more direct attention here in the class, it was founded by, and the CEO of which was Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel James Reese. And Lieutenant Colonel James Reese, immediately prior to founding the Tiger Swan Private Military Corporation, had been the director of worldwide anti-terrorist operations for Blackwater International. Blackwater International had been created pursuant to a memorandum, a major study actually, that was prepared by the Halliburton Corporation under the direction of Dick Cheney when he was the CEO for Halliburton, in between his having served as the Secretary of Defense for George Bush Sr., and then coming on to serve as the Vice President and the chair of the 5412 Committee, heading up covert operations for the W. Bush administration. That this creation of this private military operation, first Blackwater, and then Blackwater spinning off Tiger Swan Private Military Corporation, headed up by James Reese, was fielded for the first time domestically against American citizens. These private military corporations had, since their resurgence, had been deployed only internationally in Iraq and Afghanistan against the indigenous people in the Middle East, also in Africa, in Nigeria, against the indigenous people, the tribal people that were trying to oppose the drilling of oil and the contamination of their water there. Also in Ecuador, on behalf of the private oil corporations against the indigenous people, the tribal people in Ecuador, who were trying to stop the major oil corporations from massively contaminating their water there. But this was the first time that these types of private military forces had been deployed in the United States against citizens. And there was only one other prior time, and that was Blackwater people had been deployed into New Orleans in the wake of the massive hurricane there and the flooding there. But this was the first time that they'd been deployed in what amounted to a law enforcement capacity here in the United States, in that we uncovered during the discovery process, representing Chase Iron Eyes, who was designated by the intelligence operations of the Tiger Swan Private Military Corporation. He was designated as the leader of this group of religiously driven indigenous jihadist terrorists among the Lakota people. They actually had a chart built, a pyramid of all the different leaders that were involved in generating this insurrection against the pipeline and against the oil corporations. And in those memos, they called SITREPs. They were situation reports that were prepared by the Tiger Swan Private Military Corporation. We found them specifically not only referring to the indigenous people as these religiously driven indigenous jihadist terrorists, but we also saw memos that were prepared by the private public relations company that was brought in, virtually certainly by Tiger Swan, because the people that were brought in to run the public relations operations against the Lakota people that were the water protectors was the same public relations personnel that were brought into Afghanistan when Lieutenant Colonel James Reese served as the liaison between the United States Pentagon's Joint Special Operations Command and the American Central Intelligence Agency in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that this public relations outfit was headed up by a fellow by the name of Mark Feifel. Mark Feifel headed up a private public relations firm that was called the Behind the Scenes Public Relations. And he actually put out memos with bullet points on them, instructing the local police and sheriff's departments about how to refer to the people. And it was in those kind of memos that we found these references to referring to the indigenous people, the Lakota people, as indigenous terrorists and jihadist terrorists. And so that this overarching view of the indigenous people had been developed by these private military corporations in the Middle East, where they had developed a whole covert operations to go in to try to disempower these indigenous organizations in the Middle East who were opposing the occupation of the Middle Eastern oil fields by the United States military. And the reason that I point out this particular quote from Bannon in his capacity as a member of the National Security Council of the Trump administration was because, as I said, we traced that exact same language into the situation reports that we obtained from the Tigris One Private Military Corporation. And this harkened back to an earlier set of information that we had had. I had gotten information when I was in Rome back in 2017, 2015, 2016. So this was 2016. In June of 2016, I was at the Vatican having meetings there, and a man by the name of Johann Ix, who was the head of the Vatican library and the archives, invited me into his office, and he showed me a videotape of Steve Bannon actually having this. He piped into a meeting that was being held in the Vatican by a group called the Institute for Human Dignity. It was really this hardcore right-wing kind of fascist group of people from around Italy, mostly, that they were people that participated in a group called Opus Dei, this right-wing Catholic kind of semi-fascist group, and the Knights of Malta, which is kind of a full-fledged fascist group. That they were people that were involved in these meetings of this Institute for Human Dignity, and Steve Bannon piped in through Skype to do a presentation to them. And this was on June 27th of 2014. And he gave a big long speech and answered a number of questions that these people had. And it was at this time that he sort of laid out to them this kind of overarching strategic vision that he had and that he was communicating to Donald Trump, in which he was asserting that it was the indigenous people, the people that were non-Christian people, non-white, non-Christian indigenous people around the world that constituted an extreme threat to the vision that he had of trying to reestablish a white Christian culture in the West in order to defend ourselves ultimately against China. That somehow the United States and the European countries were degenerating. They started losing access to their Christian, Judeo-Christian roots, and that this had to be reestablished if we were going to gird our loins against the rise of this new Asian empire in China and East Asia, and that we had to deal with these indigenous people in Western civilization who were basically attempting to infiltrate and organize against capitalism, because he was pointing out that capitalism is, in fact, the kind of natural moral order, as he saw it, that flowed out of basic Judeo-Christian ethical values, and that the war against the capitalists was, in fact, a war against Judeo-Christian ethics in Western civilization, and that these non-Christian indigenous people were rising up all around the world to threaten the capitalist order. And there's a long speech that he gave, which included the answers to his questions, which you can find on the internet. If you just want to look it up, it's you just look up Steve Bannon Skype call into the Vatican in 2014. And I was tempted to read bunches of quotes out of this thing for you, as you can see, except that gets too extensive. But you can look up some of those yourself. And the reason that that's important is because it echoes the writings of a guy that I mentioned to you earlier, and this fellow, Samuel P. Huntington. Samuel P. Huntington wrote this book that had its precursor as a major article in Foreign Affairs magazine. Foreign Affairs magazine is the magazine published by the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations. And this is a book that he published right at the end of the Cold War. And he published this pointing out, saying that the leaders, the economic and political and social leaders of Western civilization had to get a grip on the fact that they were in danger of being basically transcended by a new Asian empire that was rising to power under the leadership of China, and that the major post-Cold War dynamic on the planet, now that the Cold War was over between the Soviet Union and the United States, that the new challenge was going to be the rising of this new Asian empire headed up by China. And that therefore, conscious steps had to be taken on the part of the leadership of Western civilization to avoid all of this attempt on the part of non-Christian, non-Caucasian cultures to try to basically infiltrate Western civilization. And there are a whole series of, you see the little pink gizmos here in the book. There's all kinds of these quotations that are set forth in the book that are kind of things you thought they'd never say in print. But he's set it forth at the end of the Cold War, saying, look, it's time to stop shilly-shallying around, and let's be clear about what the danger is here. In all of this effort on the part of the different indigenous people around the world to infiltrate Western culture and to establish what he calls multiculturalism. This drive toward multiculturalism in Western civilization, undermining the white Christian, Judeo-Christian ethics, was a weakness in Western civilization. And that if we were going to be able to adequately and successfully confront the rise of a new Asian empire, we had to get rid of all of this multiculturalism. And we had to sort of get back to the fundamentals and understand that the basic organizing principle of Western civilization is ultimately Judeo-Christian ethical values. Ultimately, he said Christianity, and to be really clear about it, he said Roman Catholicism. And that he was pointing out that there should be a kind of a reunion, a reuniting of Roman Catholicism with Russian Orthodoxy, the Orthodox Christian Church of the Russian Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox was a major element that was important for us to focus on if we were going to unite against China in the new rising Asian empire. So you get this information coming out right at the end of the Cold War. And that this, I'm suggesting to you, is the overarching arc of what it is that's going on right now. All the things that we see happening that result in this confrontation with Trump and his strange relationship with Putin and the efforts on his part to participate with the people that are involved in the purchase of the Russian oil company and the development of the 87 billion barrels of oil under the Arctic shelf, that type of things that are going on now. All of this was pre-shadowed by these kind of conversations that were going on right at the end of the Cold War. And so what I want to do is in this the last third of the course, I want us to focus on this potential that the indigenous people have of the world to rise up against this type of a mobilization that is going on, that is centered around the seizure and occupation of the Middle Eastern oil fields and the attempt to form an alliance, a secret, deep alliance between the oil corporations of Western civilization that have had virtual monopoly control over all of the oil in the Middle Eastern oil fields since the end of the First World War, pursuant to the signing of these exclusive lease agreements with the 7 major oil corporations in Western civilization under Aramco, the American Arab Oil Corporation. This overarching dynamic that's going on now really explains a good deal of what you see happening that seems puzzling to everyone. And so what I want to do in this last third of the course, I want to kind of review the history of this aggression on the part of Western powers to seize and control the Middle Eastern oil fields, to now try to establish this kind of sub rosa alliance with Putin and the Russian oligarchs to potentially gain access to the oil fields in Russia, both under the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, and also, very importantly, up under the northern Arctic shelf, which is within the economic zone that's been declared by Russia and under the control of Rosneft, which is the private Russian oil company. Okay, and so that this is all in the context of the thing that we ended up at the end of part 2 of the course talking about, this peculiar dynamic that was going on between Trump and Putin, this peculiar involvement of these 24 people that were all invited to a closed-door VIP cocktail on April 27th of 2016 to be there for the first major foreign policy speech given by Donald Trump, which had been moved from the National Press Gallery suddenly to the Mayflower Hotel, sponsored by the Center for the National Interest. That goes a long way in explaining what the dynamic is that's going on there. And you'll remember that one of the people that was there, in addition to the people who were participants actively in purchasing the 20% of the Russian oil company, that one of the other people that was there was Robert McFarlane, one of the characters in the Iran-Contra scandal. And Robert McFarlane is the one who, shortly after that April 27th VIP cocktail party, where the 24 people were, including him, he wrote the article in the National Interest, the magazine of the Center for the National Interest, in which he said Russia will become an integral partner with the United States in ensuring the energy security of the Western world, which is a little peculiar because what this means now is they're perceiving, this group of people that were around Trump in that gathering, they perceive Russia no longer as being part of the East. You know, the whole long East-West conflict that people were using to characterize the confrontation between Russia or the Soviet Union and the United States no longer seems to obtain. That Russia is being considered part of the West in a certain sense. And so the question is, if Russia is now part of the West in being a partner in ensuring the security of the petroleum and energy for the Western world, who's the Eastern world? Well, the Eastern world becomes the potential rise of the new Asian empire under China. And so suddenly this begins to echo something that we talked about before, again, only in passing, but we're going to focus on in this 1/3 of the course, and that is this peculiar dynamic that went on in the week immediately following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union dissolved on December 31st of 1991, I pointed out to you before, and the reason that I reiterate this again and again is sort of like Rachel Maddow. I just keep saying it over and over and over again, and so that you'll remember it, is that in that Monday morning following the dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 31st of 1991, in the first week of January, there was this convocation of people in the West Wing of the White House under President George H.W. Bush in his Defense Department, under his Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, that Paul Wolfowitz, Scooter Libby, Doug Feith, Elliott Abrams, David Addington, a whole group of these people got together and they began to draft the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance Document. And in this document, as I pointed out earlier, they asserted that here, now that the Cold War is over, we, the United States, are the sole remaining superpower on the entire planet. And so there's going to be a big push on the part of people to cut our military budget. Because after all, for the last 75 years, since the overthrow of the Tsar Nicholas II, in October of 1917, at the end of World War I, ever since that time, there's been this Cold War that we here in the United States, in the executive branch, has used as the rationale for a massive military budget every year. That we've insisted that the Soviet Union is dedicated to trying to take over the entire world, and so it's our job to stop them from doing that, so that we have to have ranging from $100 billion to $200 billion to $400 billion to $500 billion, ultimately up to $700+ billion a year. We have to lay claim to the tax money that comes in through the IRS to fund the most massive military in the history of human civilization. And so that now that the Cold War is over, and the rationale that we have put forth for the last 75 years justifying this kind of massive expenditure, we're going to start getting kind of a lot of pressure to cut the budget. But what we need to do instead is to increase the budget. They said what we need to do is we need to establish the most powerful military in the history of the world so that we can establish full spectrum dominance over every other nation in the world, in every other group of actors of any kind, wherever they are, and against every country, even including inside their own territory. We have to have that type of military capacity. And they prepared that first draft of that document, and they circulated it in April of 1992 to a very select number of members of the cabinet of George H.W. Bush, and a very select number of generals over at the Pentagon. But as I pointed out, one of them leaked a copy of this first draft of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document to the Washington Post. The Washington Post wrote this scathing editorial attacking it as a reemergence of American imperialism and gunboat diplomacy. The New York Times followed that the following Sunday morning in the Sunday New York Times with a second editorial against that, again condemning it as a new age of American imperialism. And George Bush Sr. issued a public statement stating that he wasn't going to acknowledge whether there was or there wasn't such a top secret document in the Defense Department. But even if there were, it was only a first draft, and therefore there would be an additional draft of this. And in fact, he personally engaged in preparing a second draft of this, along with Theodore G. Shackley, his former ADDO, the Associate Deputy Director for Operations of the CIA, when George Bush Sr. was the director of the CIA, back from 1975 to 77, and also with Colin Powell. And the three of them drafted this second draft, and it was virtually identical, the same themes and everything, except that instead of proposing the unilateral establishment of full spectrum dominance over the rest of the world, they proposed that this be done in alliance with other Western countries. And in that second draft, it specifically proposed that this new alliance be the United States, Canada, Mexico, with a little parens saying that it really means the PRI in Mexico, not the indigenous people of Mexico, but the PRI, which is primarily the Castilian Spanish, Caucasians, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Spain, the new reunified Germany, and Russia, if Russia would choose to join in this, now that they had spun off all of their ethnic provinces. And that the purpose of this new Northern Industrial Alliance, as they referred to it, would be to maintain our continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials needed by members of the new Northern Industrial Alliance. Suddenly you have now Russia being included in the plan of the Bush Sr. administration to be part of this new Northern Industrial Alliance, being suddenly considered by Bud McFarlane and others that were in the Reagan-Bush administration to be part of Western culture, as distinct from the East, which is China. And so what you see happening here is that, as we've said, that this is an attempt in the third part of our course here to explain Trump's reductionist, that is kind of simple-minded effort to partner with Putin and the oligarchs in Russia business-wise, because that's how it occurs to Trump, that let's establish a business relationship between myself and Putin to secure and develop the world's petroleum resources, which in fact are to protect the energy access of Western civilization, implicitly to maintain our continued privileged access to this strategic raw material needed by members of the new Northern Industrial Alliance for the purpose of enabling us to establish full spectrum dominance over the rest of the world, over all the nations and group actors on the planet. And this would be, of course, the non-Caucasian, in case you hadn't noticed the common theme behind the members of the Northern Industrial Alliance. Those are all predominantly Caucasian nations that are beginning to see themselves as under threat from this influx of non-Caucasian people coming into North America from South America, and coming into Europe from the various North African countries and Middle Eastern countries, and that this is the dynamic that we see happening here in the larger context of this new Northern Industrial Alliance attempting to maintain virtual monopoly control over the sources of plutonium, which is, of petroleum, to maintain control over the petroleum of the world, not only all of the petroleum in North America, including the tar fields, the tar sands fields in Canada, with the Keystone XL pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline, under the Bakken oil fields of the Canadian southern border in northern United States, to basically pipe them all the way down through the central part of the United States, through Lakota territory, down to the Gulf Coast, where it can be refined and shipped out for sale to countries other than China. And also, remember, right at the end of that Cold War, what they were looking at was also reaching out to try to establish some type of a partnership with the new Russia to develop the oil and the natural gas under the Caspian Sea, the oil and petroleum under the Black Sea, and this extraordinary 87 billion barrels of oil under the Arctic shelf of Russia, trying to establish monopoly control over the petroleum, which of course is what is engineing the rockets and the bombers and the jet fighters and the tanks and the armored personnel carriers and virtually all the aircraft carriers, except for a couple of the new nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. The petroleum is the source of power for Western civilization, establishing its hegemony over the world and over its resources. Therefore, the history, the Pulitzer Prize-winning account of the history of oil, the epic quest for oil, money, and power by David Yergin. This is that casual reading I suggested you might just sort of put under your pillow and be able to read portions of it as you were falling asleep at night. So you'll know basically what the dynamic is that's going on here. So that's what we're up to here in this final month or so, month and a half of the remaining part of the course, is trying to determine what the role is of the indigenous people in trying to stop and roll back this specific offensive on the part of the white Caucasian, business class, the elite in Western civilization, who are attempting to monopolize all of the petroleum of the world and to hold it out of the hands of China. So where do we start in attempting to evaluate the potential efficacy of the indigenous people to successfully organize, along with allies, as we saw at Standing Rock, that they were members of 300 different tribes in North America that came together at Standing Rock, but there were literally tens of thousands of non-Native American people that came to their support, not only on site, physically at the site there in North Dakota, up at the edge of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, but tens of thousands of people around the world who, in fact, provided support. Sent money, and they sent food and warm clothing and things for the people that were there. Now, the first option that we have of where do we start in a conversation like this, the first potential of that, the first option that we could start right back at the founding of the United States government after the Revolutionary War, the creation of the United States Constitution, where you had the Hamiltonians, who, remember Alexander Hamilton being the lawyer for the bankers and the financiers and the mercantile class, basically proposing that an elitist government be created similar to that of England. But rather than having an inherited aristocracy, they would agree to have an elected set of representatives. But they actually proposed that the president of the United States be chosen for life, just like a king. They insisted that the senators be chosen not by elected vote of the regular people, but by the state legislatures in the colonies, and that the state legislatures were voted for only by white male property owners. And they proposed in their form of the Constitution that only white male property owners who elected the legislators be allowed to pick the senators. And that they excluded specifically from the voting power not only non-property owners and not only women and not only non-white people, but explicitly excluded black people, not even entitling them to be valued as a full person in taking the census. And they also excluded Indians, specifically excluded Indians from being considered as part of this whole process. And they were advocating a very clear type of government run by the businesses, for the businesses. It was the motivation for the new federal government was primarily from the mercantile class that wanted to have a set of common weights and measures for the different colonies. And they wanted to be able to facilitate commerce among the colonies. And they were in tension with the Madisonians. Now, they're often referred to as the Jeffersonians and Jeffersonian democracy, but the reality is that the leader of that entire operation was James Madison. And James Madison is the one who had drafted the Virginia Constitution. It was James Madison who had, in fact, studied under John Witherspoon at the University of New Jersey, along with Aaron Burr, and along with 39 members of the Senate and like 25 different members of the Congress, the original Congress, and 3 United States Supreme Court justices, and 14 different federal judges. It was Madison that understood the concept of natural law and infused portions of the Constitution with this fundamental set of principles. Most especially, of course, the Bill of Rights, in which they asserted that if you're going to have this kind of elite-controlled government that the Hamiltonians were proposing, there had to be a specific provision for protecting individual liberties set forth in the Bill of Rights. But even those people, even though they were stating things such as that all men are created equal and they're endowed by their Creator with these inalienable rights, that there was a foreshadowing of a dynamic that could take place over time to include more people into the electorate and into the citizenship of this new government. But I'm going to be arguing that we probably shouldn't start all the way back there. We should take a look past the end of the Revolutionary War to the end of the American Civil War. In the American end of the Civil War in 1868, that whole period from the founding of the Constitution in 1789 and the Bill of Rights in 1791 all the way up to 1868, which is not that long a period of time. I mean, you're talking about an 80-year period. You're talking about the time of like one lifetime. But at the end of the American Civil War, that ended the period of the big struggle that was going on between the Hamiltonians on the one hand and the Madisonians on the other hand. And the Hamiltonians basically won in the American Civil War. That Civil War was about a lot of things other than freeing the black people from slavery. In fact, the whole Emancipation Proclamation wasn't even issued by Lincoln until well into the Civil War. The causes of it were myriad, but the fundamental conflict was between the urban industrialists and the more agrarian people. And I'm arguing that there is a second option for where we should begin this conversation about what happened to the indigenous people and the role that the indigenous people might play in countering this offensive on the part of this elite aristocratic, the financiers and their lawyers and stuff. And that is at the end of the Civil War, there was this extraordinarily important period of just like 30 years. I mean, 30 years. And if you go from here back to like 1990, 30 years from now, backwards, you're basically looking at George Bush Sr. as the President of the United States. So just between that time when George Bush Sr. was the President of the United States up till now, that short 30-year period, there was a similar 30-year period after the end of the American Civil War from 1868 to 1898 when this extraordinary transformation took place in the United States. And these robber barons basically rose to power. And they created, largely through their appointment of people to the federal courts, they established this new vehicle for commerce. And it was the shareholder-owned private corporation, in which the corporation would be deemed to be a person, and that person owned all of the assets of the company. And there were shareholders that owned shares of that corporation, but they were completely immunized against any personal liability for anything the company did. And that was an extraordinary break with all of history. Any person, or even combination of persons who wanted to join together to engage in some particular form of business undertaking, were at least responsible legally for whatever it is they did. If they injured somebody, if they made a product that injured somebody, or they did something to ruin the entire community with their business, they were considered to be legally liable for that. But this new business vehicle that was created by these people at the end of the Civil War, and actually 1872, a series of decisions that were made by the various courts that were peopled by lawyers who had been appointed to the federal judicial positions basically by these rich and powerful people. And that during that 30-year period between 1868 and 1898, there rose to power some 30 to 40 individuals who were engaged in monopolizing through the creation of this new business vehicle, all of the railroads, all of the steel and iron production, all of the mining, all of the agricultural business. They took over all of the textile mills. They bought out anybody. They crushed anybody who tried to compete with them. And they engaged in this process. And very importantly, they also took direct control of the United States Congress. They took control by just paying money to the people that were candidates for the House of Representatives and the Senate and the presidents. And they took over control of the entire government. Yes.
Is this what they call limited liability corporations?
This which?
Like LLCs?
The LLC is a new thing. This was just the regular private shareholder-owned business corporation. It was what they call a Corp C right now. It's a regular corporation. This is the fundamental premise of those corporations. Prior to that time, a corporation was something that was set up extremely rarely by the government for a government purpose. Like they would set up a corporation to build a turnpike, or they would set up a corporation to build a canal. And they would entice private investors to come in as a partnership to build this turnpike or a canal or something. And they would be allowed for a certain term of years to recoup their investment with a profit for it. And so they set up a special corporation to do this. They actually did that for some of the colonies. They actually, over in England, they set up a corporation for them to, the Massachusetts Bay Colony Corporation, for example, was a thing like that. But they existed for a very specific limited period of time, for a very specific public purpose, and then they were dissolved. But this new business vehicle that they created shortly after the American Civil War, in a short 30-year period, was used by these 30 to say 50 people to establish complete control over virtually all elements of the economy of the American government. And they seized control of the government itself. And it came to full fruition in 1898, the election in 1896, of McKinley. William McKinley was elected president. His basic political advisor was Mark Hanna. I think I mentioned him in the past. Mark Hanna was the man. He was like the Karl Rove to George W. Bush. The brain of Bush. He was the brain of McKinley. And Mark Hanna is the guy that when he was asked what was the highest possible ambition any human being could have, he said, to earn as much money as you possibly can before you die. That was his vision and it was representative of that whole robber baron era. And very importantly, for the purposes of this last third of our course, this was the period of manifest destiny. This was this entire robber baron class of people undertook a whole doctrine of manifest destiny in which they asserted that they were entitled to basically take over all of the resources of entire North America, and that they were able to wipe out and take away all of the land from the native indigenous people. They went to war against them all. They rounded them up and they slaughtered them and they put them in prison camps, and they took their children and put them into these boarding schools and ordered them to stop speaking their language. If they were caught off one of these reservations, these prison encampments, they could be killed by any white person lawfully, and took all of their property away from them. And this was the era not only of manifest destiny, it was the era of the white man's burden. This was an entire doctrine that they had, that white people, being inherently racially superior to all of the other races, were entitled to govern. That they had this burden, this kind of noblesse oblige. They had this obligation to take charge of all the resources, to develop them all, because all of these brown people and red people and black people are sitting on these resources, and they don't even know enough to use them. They don't even know enough to kind of totally despoil the land and transform the beauty of our planet into power. And so therefore, they're not entitled. And so this is what happened. This era is an extraordinarily important starting point for us to look to understand how this group of white male property owners and their lawyers that were representing the mercantile class and the financial interests and the banking interests, et cetera, basically established full dominion, not only over North America, but they began this quest, this imperial quest of the age of American imperialism. And the fact of the matter is, they even teach this in high schools. They say, oh yeah, that was kind of a tough period. That was when we were misbehaving a bit. Like as if that was, well, okay, you killed tens of thousands, wiped out hundreds of thousands of Native American people, you enslaved, tens of thousands of people and bred them like cattle, and well, yeah, that was a bad period. It probably wasn't the best thing we could have been doing. It's that kind of thing, how they teach it in the American schools. But this particular period in history sows the seeds of what we're facing now. We're reaping the whirlwind of this particular sowing that went on during that entire period of time. In the United States, during this particular age of imperialism, decided that they were going to expand southward into South America, They were basically going to establish complete dominance and hegemony over all the resources in South America. And then they decided they were going to go west. They were going to go out into the Pacific Ocean, and they were going to take charge of Hawaii, the Philippine Islands, Guam, and they were working their way over toward China, is what they were doing. They saw the entire resources of China, the entire mainland of China, off at the other side of the Pacific Ocean as their unique resources. So that we wanted to establish not only unique dominion over all of South America, but we wanted to establish our unique access and control over the resources in China. And that what we did is we were going to leave to Europe the debating between and among, the UK, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Austria. Let those European countries argue it out themselves as to who was going to be in charge over there. And so when World War I began, arising out of a clash of the interests of all of those major imperial agents over there, those different nation states, we were just going to stay out of it. And we were going to continue to mobilize and exercise control over South America and Central America and move west into the Pacific. That is what was happening. And when we got to, we didn't even come into the World War. World War started in 1914. We didn't even come in until 1917. And we didn't even have any troops on the scene until late into 1917. And what we concentrated on doing is sending an expeditionary force into Russia, primarily, to go into Russia to crush the Bolshevik Revolution that had arisen. Because in October of 1917, the peasants and people of Russia rose up against Tsar Nicholas II and overthrew him and established the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And declared that they were withdrawing from World War I. And so the United States, under the leadership of Robert Lansing, who was the Secretary of State, sent a United States-led foreign military expeditionary force into Russia to try to crush the Bolshevik Revolution. So there started that trouble. Okay? And the United States then joined in the drafting of the Versailles Treaty at the end of World War I. And I've talked with you about this before, but the Robert Lansing, as the Secretary of State, was the son-in-law of John W. Foster, who had been the Secretary of State in 1893 under Benjamin Harrison.